A rare military theorist is honored with a comparison to Napoleon. Mikhail Tukhachevsky earned this moniker not only thanks to a brilliant career, but also to his gift of foresight. In the 1930s, when many armies of the world still relied on the experience of positional battles of the First World War, he already saw the contours of future wars. Maneuverable, swift, with deep breakthroughs of mechanized units. The young Marshal, who received this rank at the age of 35, was creating a new type of army. His theory of deep operation, the concept of interaction between tanks, aviation, and airborne troops, was decades ahead of its time. It was Tukhachevsky who laid the foundation for the military might that would later stop the German war machine. Surprisingly, the man who foresaw the nature of the future World War did not live to see it. His life was tragically cut short. In 1937, the Marshal was arrested on false charges and shot. The fate of a military genius whose ideas outlived him became one of the most dramatic pages in Soviet history. Mikhail Nikolaevich Tukhachevsky was born on February 15, 1893, on the Alexandrovskoye estate in the Smolensk governorate. His family belonged to an ancient but impoverished noble lineage, tracing its history back to Count Indris, who arrived in Russia from the Holy Roman Empire in the 13th century. The future Marshal's father served as a minor official, and his mother came from a family of Russified Frenchmen, de Fleury. Mikhail's childhood was spent in an atmosphere of a cult of education and respect for military service. Despite their modest means, his parents strived to give their children the best education. At the age of 10, Mikhail entered the Moscow Gymnasium, where he displayed remarkable abilities in the exact sciences and languages. Classmates remembered him as a serious, determined young man with an analytical mind. Interestingly, in his youth, Tukhachevsky was keen on music and even independently made a violin. This skill of working with his hands and understanding technology would later prove useful to him in modernizing the army. In 1911, after graduating from the gymnasium, Mikhail entered the prestigious Alexandrovskoye Military School in Moscow. His choice was dictated not only by family traditions, but also by a personal aspiration for a military career. At the school, Tukhachevsky stood out among his peers for his discipline and deep interest in military history. He spent hours in the library studying the works of great commanders, Suvorov, Napoleon, Moltke. He was particularly drawn to Napoleon's campaigns, with their swift maneuvers and decisive actions. Even then, his view of war as the art of maneuver and concentration of forces at the decisive point was forming. In 1914, having graduated from the school with honors, Sub-Lieutenant Tukhachevsky was assigned to the elite Leibgard Semyonovsky Regiment. Just a few weeks after his graduation, World War I began, and the young officer went to the front. In battles, Tukhachevsky proved himself to be a brave and proactive commander. For an attack near the village of Lomna, he was awarded the Order of St. Vladimir, 4th degree with swords and bow, and for battles in East Prussia, the Order of St. Anna. The French government noted his valor with the Croix de Guerre, an award of which he was particularly proud. However, in February 1915, fate played a cruel trick on him. During a reconnaissance mission, he was captured by the Germans. His time in captivity became a true school of life for Tukhachevsky. He was held in various prisoner of war camps for officers, including the infamous Ingolstadt, where he met the future president of France, Charles de Gaulle. Despite the harsh conditions, Tukhachevsky did not lose his spirit. He studied German, read military literature, and planned an escape. 5 times he tried to escape, and each time he was caught. Only on the 6th attempt, in September 1917, did he manage to cross the Swiss border. Through France, England, and Scandinavia, he returned to Russia, which was no longer the country he had left. The February Revolution had overthrown the monarchy, and the provisional government had come to power. Tukhachevsky arrived in Petrograd in the midst of a political crisis. Before him, as before many officers, stood a dramatic choice: which side to take in the escalating civil war. Unlike most of his comrades from the Semyonovsky regiment, in April 1918, he joined the Red Army and soon joined the Bolshevik Party. This decision was dictated not so much by ideological considerations as by a pragmatic view of Russia's future and a desire to apply his military talents. The Bolsheviks, in dire need of professional military personnel, quickly appreciated the abilities of the young commander. Already in June 1918, at the age of 25, Tukhachevsky was appointed commander of the First Army of the Eastern Front. The Civil War became for Tukhachevsky a swift ascent to the heights of a military career. The young commander of the First Army quickly proved himself to be a talented tactician and organizer. His first serious test was the struggle against the Czechoslovak Corps and the troops of Admiral Kolchak on the Eastern Front. In these battles, Tukhachevsky demonstrated the ability to quickly assess the situation and make unconventional decisions. He actively used maneuver, concentrating forces on the main attack directions and employing tactics of swift flanking envelopments. The Simbirsk operation in the summer of 1918 was particularly illustrative. The city where Lenin was born was occupied by the Whites, and its liberation had not only military but also symbolic significance. Tukhachevsky brilliantly organized the offensive, regrouping forces and creating a shock force in the decisive direction. On September 12th, Simbirsk was liberated, and Tukhachevsky sent Lenin a laconic telegram. "Simbirsk, the birthplace of Vladimir Ilyich, has been taken. Revolutionary Military Council of the First Army." The successes of the young army commander did not go unnoticed. Already in November 1918, he was appointed commander of the Eastern Front. At 25 years old, a group of several 100,000 fighters came under his command. In this position, Tukhachevsky developed and carried out the Zlatoust and Chelyabinsk operations, which led to the defeat of Kolchak's main forces. It was here that his unique style began to form: a desire for deep breakthroughs, the use of cavalry as a mobile means of developing success, and the ability to organize the interaction of various branches of service. In the spring of 1920, Tukhachevsky received a new appointment: commander of the Western Front in the war against Poland. This campaign became both the pinnacle of his successes and a source of bitter experience. Initially, operations developed brilliantly. Tukhachevsky organized a powerful offensive, breaking through the Polish front and forcing the enemy to retreat. His troops rapidly advanced, liberating Minsk, Vilno, Grodno. In July, they crossed the ethnic border of Poland, creating a threat to Warsaw. It seemed that the revolution was about to spread to Europe. However, at this moment, the weak points of the military leader also manifested themselves: excessive self-confidence and underestimation of the enemy. By stretching communications and not ensuring proper interaction with the Southwestern Front under the command of Igorov and Stalin, Tukhachevsky found himself vulnerable to the Polish counterattack. In mid-August, Polish troops launched a surprise attack on the flank of the advancing group. A retreat began, turning into a catastrophe that went down in history as the, quote, "The Red Army lost tens of thousands of soldiers killed, wounded, and captured." This defeat became a harsh lesson for Tukhachevsky. He deeply analyzed the causes of the failure and drew important conclusions about the need to preserve reserves, secure flanks, and organize reliable communication between units. Later, These lessons formed the basis of his theoretical works. Despite the failure near Warsaw, Tukhachevsky's authority in the army remained high. In early 1921, he was appointed commander of the Kronstadt district troops to suppress the uprising of Baltic Fleet sailors. The operation was carried out decisively and harshly. The fortress was stormed across the ice of the Gulf of Finland. Then, Tukhachevsky led the troops suppressing the peasant uprising in the Tambov province. The methods he used, including the hostage system and the use of chemical weapons against the rebels, later caused much controversy. However, it was these actions that finally cemented his reputation as a firm and uncompromising commander, devoted to the revolution. By the end of the Civil War, Tukhachevsky had formed as a military leader with his own style and vision of modern warfare. His experience commanding large formations in various conditions, from the steppes of Siberia to the forests of Belarus, gave him a unique understanding of the capabilities and limitations of existing military equipment and tactics. After the active phase of the Civil War ended, Tukhachevsky had the opportunity to engage in what he had a particular inclination for: military theory. The early 1920s became a period of intense reflection on the experience of the world in civil wars. It was then that his revolutionary ideas, decades ahead of their time, were born. In 1921, Tukhachevsky headed the Red Army Military Academy, where he fostered an atmosphere of creative exploration and bold experimentation. He gathered around him talented officers capable of unconventional thinking: Triandafilov, Isserson, Svechin. Together, they analyzed the lessons of past wars and tried to look into the future. War will be mechanized and maneuverable. This phrase became the leitmotif of Tukhachevsky's theoretical works. At a time when many military theorists continue to think in terms of positional warfare, he already saw the contours of future lightning campaigns. His main theoretical achievement was the concept of a fundamentally new approach to offensive actions. In contrast to the linear tactics of World War I, Tukhachevsky proposed simultaneous strikes across the entire depth of the enemy's defense. The breakthrough was to be carried out by concentrated mechanized formations supported by aviation. The success was to be developed by echeloned tank and motorized units operating at great depth. The final chord was airborne landings, cutting off the enemy's retreat routes. This concept, outlined in the works quote, 2 and quote, 3, revolutionized military thought. Tukhachevsky virtually anticipated the blitzkrieg tactics later employed by the Germans. Surprisingly, his ideas met with resistance from the conservative part of the command, led by Voroshilov, who considered them too radical. Tukhachevsky paid special attention to the role of technology in his works. Quote 4, he asserted, insisting on the mass mechanization of the army. He was the first to recognize the decisive role of tanks as the main striking force. In his concept, they were to act not in support of infantry, but independently in large formations, creating a shock and breakthrough effect. Tukhachevsky's views on the role of aviation were no less revolutionary. He saw it not merely as a reconnaissance or auxiliary tool, but as an independent force capable of solving strategic tasks. His idea of creating air armies operating deep in the enemy's rear anticipated the concept of strategic bombing in World War II. A crucial element of Tukhachevsky's theory was the understanding of war as a complex phenomenon. In his work, War as a Problem of Armed Struggle, he wrote about the need to mobilize all of the state's resources, industrial, scientific, human. He was the first in Soviet military thought to speak of the total nature of future conflicts, where victory would depend not only on the bravery of soldiers, but also on the economic power of the country. Tukhachevsky's theoretical works did not remain on paper. In the mid-1920s, he had the opportunity to test his ideas in practice, becoming commander of the Leningrad military district. Here, he organized a series of experimental exercises where new tactical methods were refined. It was in Leningrad that the first experiments on the mass use of tanks and airborne landings were conducted. In the early 1930s, Tukhachevsky received a unique opportunity to put his theoretical ideas into practice. In 1931, he was appointed Chief of Armaments of the Red Army, and then Deputy People's Commissar for Military and Naval Affairs. In these posts, he was tasked with transforming the Red Army from a semi-guerrilla formation into a modern war machine capable of confronting the best armies in the world. From his first days in the new position, Tukhachevsky launched a large-scale program of technical rearmament. He perfectly understood. Future wars would be won by whoever possessed superiority in technology. This idea became the basis of all his reforms. The Marshal personally supervised the development of new types of weapons, visited factories and design bureaus, and met with engineers. The first step was the creation of mechanized formations, prototypes of future tank armies. On Tukhachevsky's initiative, the first mechanized corps was formed in 1932, including tank, motorized rifle, and aviation units. This was a revolutionary decision. At that time, most armies of the world considered tanks only as a means of infantry support. Tukhachevsky, however, saw in them the main strike force, capable of making deep breakthroughs and encirclements. The Marshal paid particular attention to the quality of armored vehicles. Under his leadership, the development of new tank models began, including the legendary T-34, a machine that later became a symbol of Soviet military might. Tukhachevsky insisted on an optimal combination of firepower, protection, and mobility, which later became the classic formula for tank building. No less important direction of reforms was the development of aviation. Tukhachevsky was one of the first to appreciate the strategic importance of the air fleet. On his initiative, a whole network of aviation design bureaus was created where fighters, bombers, and attack aircraft were developed. He personally supported talented designers, Tupolev, Polikarpov, Ilyushin. Thanks to this support, by the mid-1930s, Soviet aviation made a qualitative leap, creating models that were not inferior to the best world analogs. A revolutionary step was the creation of airborne troops. Tukhachevsky was convinced that future operations would require the landing of large forces in the enemy's rear. Under his leadership, the first experiments in mass airborne assault were conducted. In 1933, during exercises in the Belarusian military district, a parachute assault of more than 1,000 people was dropped for the first time, an unprecedented operation for that time. At the same time, Tukhachevsky worked on modernizing the troop control system. He understood that in a rapidly changing environment, communication and coordination of actions acquire critical importance. At his insistence, the army was actively equipped with radio stations, and special communications units were created. The Marshal promoted the idea of a unified control system, uniting all branches of forces. Tukhachevsky did not forget about the, quote, infantry. On his initiative, the rearmament of rifle units with automatic weapons began. Under his patronage, the designer Degtyarev developed a light machine gun, which became the main infantry support weapon. Work was also underway on the creation of an assault rifle, a weapon capable of providing infantry with the necessary firepower. Tukhachevsky's reforms met with serious resistance. The conservative part of the command, led by Voroshilov, considered his plans too costly and radical. The idea of creating large tank formations caused particularly sharp disputes. Tukhachevsky's opponents argued that such a concentration of equipment would make the army vulnerable to enemy aircraft. However, the Marshal stubbornly defended his position, finding support among advanced commanders and engineers. If Mikhail Tukhachevsky went down in history as the theorist of deep operations, then the practical embodiment of his ideas became the armored forces, the steel fist of the Red Army. In the early 1930s, the Marshal took a revolutionary step. He proposed creating large tank formations capable of operating independently, and not just in support of infantry. This idea contradicted the dogmas of that time. Most military theorists, relying on the experience of the First World War, saw tanks only as a means of overcoming fortified positions. Tukhachevsky, however, thought differently. "A tank is not just an armored support vehicle," he said at a meeting of the Higher Command Staff in 1932. "It is an instrument of deep breakthrough, a means of creating chaos in the enemy's rear." At his insistence, the first mechanized corps were formed in 1932, including tank, motorized rifle, and aviation units. This was a true revolution in military affairs. Tukhachevsky paid special attention to the quality of armored vehicles. He understood that mass production must be combined with high combat characteristics. Under his leadership, the development of new tank models began, embodying the principle of an optimal balance between firepower, protection, and mobility. Tukhachevsky personally oversaw the creation of the T-28 medium tank and its successor, the legendary T-34. He often visited the Kharkov locomotive plant, where these machines were created, met with designers, and delved into technical details. The Marshal insisted on a diesel engine for the new tanks, a decision that later saved thousands of tankers' lives, as diesel fuel is less flammable. Observing exercises, Tukhachevsky constantly improved the tactics of using tank formations. He developed methods for breaking through enemy defenses, forcing rivers, and operating in urban areas. Special attention was paid to the interaction of tanks with aviation and artillery. The Marshal emphasized, during maneuvers in the Belarusian military district in 1936, Tukhachevsky, for the first time in world practice, organized exercises where a tank corps operated at a depth of more than 100 kilometers, with air support and airborne landings ahead. These exercises became the prototype of future deep operations of the Great Patriotic War. The concept of using tank formations developed by Tukhachevsky strikingly resembled the blitzkrieg tactics that the Germans used at the beginning of World War II. A rapid breakthrough of enemy defenses, swift advance into the depth, encirclement of large groupings. All this was anticipated in the works of the Soviet Marshal. It is noteworthy that German military theorists carefully studied his ideas. General Heinz Guderian, the creator of the German tank forces, later acknowledged the influence of Soviet developments on the formation of the Wehrmacht's Panzer concept. However, fate played a cruel trick on Tukhachevsky. In 1937, when his theories had already begun to be embodied in metal, the Marshal was arrested on a false charge of treason. After his execution, many progressive ideas were rejected as sabotage. Mechanized corps were disbanded, and tanks were again considered primarily as a means of infantry support. Only the bitter experience of the first months of the war with Germany forced the Soviet command to return to Tukhachevsky's concepts. Tank corps and armies were recreated, and the principles of deep operations formed the basis of the Red Army's offensive actions. It was these formations that became the main strike force in the decisive battles of the war, near Moscow, Stalingrad, Kursk. The armored fist, created according to the blueprints of the repressed Marshal, crushed the war machine of the Third Reich. Dreaming of the sky and deep breakthroughs, Mikhail Tukhachevsky became one of the main architects of the Soviet airborne forces. This idea did not arise out of nowhere. Studying the experience of the First World War, the Marshal concluded that future conflicts would require not only a breakthrough of the front, but also the rapid capture of key objectives in the enemy's rear. Traditional methods, cavalry raids or foot marches, no longer met the demands of the time. A fundamentally new tool was needed, and airborne assault became that tool. In 1931, near Voronezh, Tukhachevsky organized the first large-scale exercises in world history with a parachute landing. Before the astonished observers, 200 fighters descended from the sky and captured a simulated enemy airfield. The experiment was so successful that just a year later, the number of paratroopers in exercises grew to 600, and by 1933, to 1,000. This was a true breakthrough in military affairs. The Marshal personally participated in developing the tactics for airborne units. He saw their primary task as seizing bridges, airfields, headquarters, and communication nodes in the enemy's rear. Paratroopers were to create chaos, disrupt command and communications, and prepare conditions for the breakthrough of the main forces. Under Tukhachevsky's leadership, a unique system for training paratroopers was developed, which included not only parachute training but also sabotage training. Each fighter had to be able to act autonomously, detached from the main forces. Special light weapons were created for arming paratroopers, including folding anti-tank rifles and compact mortars. In parallel with the development of airborne forces, Tukhachevsky paid enormous attention to the creation of transport aviation. On his initiative, designers Tupolev and Antonov began developing special aircraft capable of transporting paratroopers and their equipment. One of the Marshal's boldest ideas was the concept of gliders. These engineless aircraft, towed by airplanes, could deliver troops precisely to their target, silently landing in the enemy's rear. The first tests of Soviet gliders took place in 1934 under Tukhachevsky's personal supervision. No less revolutionary was the Marshal's contribution to the development of military aviation. At a time when many military leaders saw aircraft only as a means of reconnaissance and artillery fire correction, Tukhachevsky viewed aviation as an independent strategic force. He was the first in Soviet military thought to speak of air armies capable of striking enemy industrial centers and communications. In the report, quote, presented in 1932, the Marshal wrote, "This idea was revolutionary for its time. Under Tukhachevsky's leadership, the development of long-range bombers capable of reaching deep into enemy territory began." He personally supported designer Tupolev in creating the multi-engine TB-1 and TB-3 aircraft, which at that time were among the best in the world. The Marshal insisted on the development of strategic aviation even when many considered it an unnecessary luxury for the young Soviet state. Simultaneously, Tukhachevsky also developed tactical aviation. He understood that in future conflicts, air superiority would acquire critical importance. On his initiative, the development of new fighters capable of countering the aviation of potential adversaries began. The Marshal supported talented designers Polikarpov and Yakovlev, who created machines that later formed the backbone of the Soviet Air Force. Tukhachevsky did not forget about air defense either. He was one of the first to realize the threat posed by air raids to large cities and industrial centers. On his initiative, a comprehensive air defense system was created, including anti-aircraft artillery, fighter aviation, and an air observation service. The Marshal insisted on developing new types of anti-aircraft guns and the first radar stations capable of detecting enemy aircraft at long ranges. Tukhachevsky not only foresaw the future of warfare, but also created the technological basis for the realization of his ideas. In the early 30s, he launched a veritable military scientific laboratory, a system of research institutes and design bureaus that worked ahead of the curve. The army of the future must rely on advanced science. This idea became fundamental to his activities as a reformer. In 1932, at Tukhachevsky's initiative, the Reactive Scientific Research Institute was established, the first institution in the country specifically engaged in rocket technology. The Marshal personally selected personnel for this secret institution, attracting talented engineers and scientists. Under his patronage worked the pioneers of Soviet rocketry, Korolev, Glushko, Tikhonravov. It was here that the first Soviet liquid propellant rockets were created and the foundations of the future space program were laid. Tukhachevsky asserted at closed meetings. At a time when many military leaders were skeptical of this direction, the Marshal insisted on the development of rocket projectiles for artillery. Under his leadership, engineers Langemak and Klimanov created the first prototypes of multiple launch rocket systems, the future legendary II, which played a huge role in the Great Patriotic War. No less important was the creation of the Military Chemical Institute, where means of protection against chemical weapons were developed and new types of toxic substances were investigated. Tukhachevsky understood that chemical weapons could become a reality of future warfare and sought to provide the army with reliable means of protection. Under his leadership, the first models of gas masks and protective suits were created, as well as systems for degassing equipment and terrain. The Marshal paid special attention to means of communication and control. At his initiative, the Scientific Research Institute of Communications was created, where field radio stations, telephone equipment, and the first samples of encryption technology were developed. Tukhachevsky understood that in conditions of maneuver warfare, reliable communication between units became critically important. He said, "At the Artillery Academy, under the patronage of the Marshal, work was carried out to create new types of weapons, more long-range, rapid-fire, and mobile." Tukhachevsky personally supervised the development of anti-tank artillery, understanding that in future conflicts, combating armored vehicles would become one of the key tasks. Under his leadership, the first models of 45mm anti-tank guns, nicknamed 45er, were created. At the Military Air Academy, the Marshal initiated research in the field of jet aviation. He supported the work of designer Korolev on the creation of the RP-1 rocket plane, an aircraft with a combined propulsion system. This was a bold step into the unknown, an attempt to look into the future of aviation. Surprisingly, Tukhachevsky also foresaw the importance of electronics in future wars. At his initiative, work began on the creation of the first radar stations capable of detecting enemy aircraft at long approaches. At that time, it seemed like science fiction, but the Marshal believed in the capabilities of new technology. One of Tukhachevsky's most far-sighted decisions was the creation of the Special Technical Bureau for Military Inventions of Special Purpose. This secret institution was engaged in the development of non-standard types of weapons, from underwater mines to radio-controlled tanks. The Marshal attracted not only military specialists, but also civilian scientists to the work, creating a unique fusion of academic science and military practice. Tukhachevsky did not just support inventors, he created an entire system for introducing new developments into the troops. At his initiative, experimental prototypes were tested in real conditions, and demonstrations of new equipment for commanding staff were organized. The Marshal personally participated in these events, demonstrating the importance of the Army's technical re-equipment. The most important principle of the Tukhachevsky Laboratory's work was freedom of creative exploration. He protected his protégés from bureaucratic pressure, creating conditions for bold experiments. "Don't be afraid to make mistakes," he told engineers. be afraid not to try new things. This atmosphere of creative freedom allowed Soviet designers to make a real breakthrough in a number of areas of military technology. Military genius demands not only the creation of new concepts, but also the upbringing of a generation of commanders capable of implementing them. Tukhachevsky perfectly understood that even the most brilliant theories would remain on paper without competent executors. The creation of a new school of military personnel became one of the Marshal's top priorities. This idea defined his approach to training command staff. Upon assuming the post of head of the RKKA Military Academy in 1921, Tukhachevsky radically changed the training system. Instead of rote memorization of regulations and studying the experience of past wars, he emphasized the development of creative thinking and initiative. He told the instructors. The curricula were completely revised. Tukhachevsky introduced courses on the latest types of weaponry, the theory of deep operations, and the interaction of different branches of service. Special attention was paid to learning foreign languages and familiarizing oneself with foreign military experience. The Marshal insisted that every commander should follow the development of military thought not only in the USSR, but also abroad. A unique system of tactical exercises and war games was created at the academy. Instead of abstract tasks, students were offered real combat situations requiring unconventional solutions. Tukhachevsky personally participated in the analysis of these exercises, mercilessly criticizing stereotypical approaches and encouraging bold ideas. This phrase became the unofficial motto of the academy. Field trips, where theoretical knowledge was tested in practice, became a revolutionary innovation. Academy students participated in maneuvers, commanded units, and mastered new equipment. Tukhachevsky believed that a future commander should not only know theory, but also feel real combat, understand the psychology of soldiers, and sense the tempo of a modern operation. The Marshal paid special attention to identifying and promoting talented officers. He created a system where capable commanders quickly advanced through the ranks, regardless of their origin or party seniority. Tukhachevsky emphasized, he personally selected promising officers for study at the academy and subsequent appointment to key positions. Among his protégés were future marshals and generals: Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Meretskov, Konev. It was these people who later led the Red Army during the Great Patriotic War. It is noteworthy that many of them underwent repression after Tukhachevsky's arrest, but remained faithful to his military ideas. Under the Marshal's leadership, a system of command training was created, covering all levels, from junior officer to front commander. Special training programs were developed for each echelon, taking into account the specifics of their tasks. Tukhachevsky insisted that a commander should not only know their own duties, but also understand the tasks of higher and lower echelons. This ensured unity of understanding of combat tasks and flexibility of command. Large-scale exercises became the most important element of commander training. During maneuvers in the Belarusian and Kiev military districts in the mid-30s, new forms of combat operations were practiced. Deep breakthroughs by mechanized formations, airborne landings, and the interaction of all branches of service. These exercises became a real school for command staff, allowing them to master the principles of modern warfare in practice. Tukhachevsky also created a special system for training staff officers. He understood that in conditions of maneuver warfare, the work of staffs, planning operations, organizing interaction, ensuring communication, acquired critical importance. The Marshal demanded that staff workers possess not only analytical thinking, but also an understanding of the real situation on the battlefield. The staff is the brain of the army, and it must feel the pulse of battle, he emphasized. By the mid-1930s, Mikhail Tukhachevsky had reached the pinnacle of his military career. First Deputy People's Commissar of Defense, Marshal of the Soviet Union, author of revolutionary military concepts, his authority in the army seemed unshakable. However, it was during this period that clouds began to gather over the brilliant military leader. The political atmosphere in the country was changing. The relative pluralism of opinions was being replaced by a rigid centralization of power in Stalin's hands. In these circumstances, Tukhachevsky's independence of judgment and boldness of ideas became increasingly dangerous for him. The first signs of impending disgrace appeared in his relations with People's Commissar of Defense, Kliment Voroshilov. Their confrontation had deep roots. Voroshilov, a former worker with minimal military education, embodied the proletarian wing in the army. Tukhachevsky, on the other hand, represented professional military men, many of whom had pre-revolutionary training. Two poles of Soviet military thought, as their contemporaries characterized them. Voroshilov was suspicious of Tukhachevsky's innovative ideas. He did not understand the significance of army mechanization, looked skeptically at the creation of large tank formations, considering it an extravagance. The People's Commissar asserted at meetings. Tukhachevsky, however, insisted, "The future war is a war of motors." These disagreements escalated into open confrontation. In 1935, at a meeting of the Military Council, Tukhachevsky presented a report on the need for accelerated development of armored forces. Voroshilov demonstratively criticized his ideas as detached from reality. Eyewitnesses remembered the icy atmosphere of that meeting. Tukhachevsky, usually restrained, could not hold back. "Comrade People's Commissar, your position could cost us victory in a future war." This phrase was perceived as a challenge. Even more dangerous for Tukhachevsky was the growing distrust on the part of Stalin. Initially, the leader valued the Marshal's military talents and supported many of his initiatives. However, as Stalin's personal power strengthened, any independence was perceived by him as a potential threat. And Tukhachevsky was too independent in his judgments, too popular in the army, too brilliant as a personality. Particular concern was caused by the Marshal's international contacts. During official visits to Germany, France, and Great Britain, he made a strong impression on foreign military personnel. The Western press called him, quote, after one such trip, Stalin coldly remarked, "In 1936, an episode occurred that became a turning point in Tukhachevsky's fate." At a meeting of the High Command, he criticized the state of the country's defense capabilities, pointing out a serious lag in the production of modern weapons. The Marshal spoke about specific problems: the shortage of new types of tanks, the weakness of aviation, the lack of communication equipment. In essence, this was constructive criticism aimed at strengthening the army. But in the atmosphere of the 1930s, such frankness was perceived as political unreliability. Stalin, who was present at the meeting, demonstratively left the hall during Tukhachevsky's speech. The next day, the Marshal was summoned to the leader. The conversation was short and ominous. "You look too gloomily at our capabilities, Comrade Tukhachevsky," Stalin said. "This leads to certain thoughts." After this meeting, the Marshal visibly changed. He became more withdrawn, more cautious in his statements. In early 1937, an open persecution of Tukhachevsky began. An article appeared in the newspaper Pravda criticizing some military theorists who had become detached from reality and proposed adventurous projects. Although the Marshal's name was not mentioned, everyone understood who was being referred to. At party meetings in military academies, accusations of, quote, began to be heard. This is what his military concepts were now called. Despite the growing pressure, Tukhachevsky continued to defend his ideas. In his last speech in his life at the General Staff Academy in April 1937, He spoke about the need to prepare for a major war, about the creation of powerful mechanized formations, about the development of aviation. Quote, "These words sounded like a warning." In May 1937, Tukhachevsky was suddenly removed from the post of First Deputy People's Commissar of Defense and appointed commander of the Volga Military District, a clear demotion for a marshal of his rank. Many perceived this as a signal of imminent disgrace. Before leaving for Kuibyshev, Tukhachevsky met with several close comrades. "I will be accused of something I never did," he said, as if foreseeing the future. On May 11, 1937, Tukhachevsky arrived in Kuibyshev to assume command of the Volga Military District. He was not destined to begin his new duties. On May 22, he was urgently summoned to Moscow, where NKVD officers arrested him right at the train station. Thus began the final, most tragic act in the life of the Red Napoleon. Tukhachevsky's arrest was part of a large-scale operation against the Red Army's high command. Almost simultaneously, Army commanders Yakir, Ubarevich, Kork, Eidemann, Feldman, Primakov, and Putna, the cream of the Soviet General Staff, the Marshal's comrades in military reforms, were detained. All of them were charged with the monstrous accusation of treason, espionage, and preparing a military coup. The investigation was conducted with unprecedented cruelty and speed. Tukhachevsky was placed in the Lubyanka's internal prison, where he was subjected to grueling interrogations. Unyielding on the battlefields, the Marshal could not withstand the physical and psychological methods of pressure. On the third day, he signed a confession of counter-revolutionary activity. Documents that became available decades later reveal the mechanism behind the fabrication of the case of the military. Confessions were obtained under torture, and evidence of connections with German intelligence was falsified. A special role was played by the so-called Beneš folder, forged documents allegedly testifying to Tukhachevsky's secret contacts with the German General Staff. Modern research confirms these materials were manufactured by a special laboratory of the SD, Security Service of Nazi Germany, at the behest of Heydrich, and transmitted to Soviet intelligence through Czechoslovak channels. Why did the Germans need to eliminate Tukhachevsky? The answer is simple. They feared his military genius. It was the Marshal who created an army capable of confronting the Wehrmacht. His theory of deep operations, the concept of mechanized formations, the development of aviation and airborne troops, all of this made the Red Army a formidable adversary. By eliminating Tukhachevsky and his comrades, the Germans hoped to decapitate the Soviet armed forces on the eve of the planned war. The trial of the Marshal and other military leaders took place on June 11, 1937. It was a closed session of the special judicial presence of the USSR Supreme Court, chaired by Ulrich. The court included Marshals Budyonny, Blucher, Army commanders Alksnis, Dybenko, Shaposhnikov, and other high-ranking military officials. Many of them were soon to share the fate of the accused. The process lasted only one day and was a mere formality. No real evidence of guilt was presented, and there was no defense. The accused, broken by torture, repeated rehearsed confessions. The verdict was predetermined. All defendants were sentenced to the highest measure of punishment. The very next day, June 12th, the sentence was carried out. Tukhachevsky's last hours of life are shrouded in mystery. According to some accounts, before his death, he found the strength to declare, "I am guilty of nothing. My conscience is clear before the party and the motherland." These words, if indeed spoken, became his final protest against monstrous injustice. The execution of Tukhachevsky and his comrades was only the beginning of a large-scale purge in the army. The Marshal's case was followed by a wave of arrests, that swept through all levels of the military hierarchy. By early 1939, 3 of 5 marshals, 13 of 15 army commanders, 60 of 85 corps commanders, and 110 of 195 division commanders had been repressed. The total number of repressed servicemen reached 40,000 people. The consequences of this purge for the Red Army's combat readiness were catastrophic. The command system was decapitated, and the continuity of command personnel was disrupted. Surviving commanders feared showing initiative, fearing accusations of many of the Marshal's progressive ideas were rejected as sabotage. Mechanized corps were disbanded, the development of airborne troops slowed down, and rearmament programs were curtailed. Especially tragic was the abandonment of the theory of deep operations, the cornerstone of Tukhachevsky's military doctrine. Instead of maneuver warfare with deep breakthroughs, concepts of positional battles again prevailed. This led to the fact that at the beginning of the Great Patriotic War, the Soviet command was unprepared for blitzkrieg, a tactic that, paradoxically, the Germans borrowed from Tukhachevsky himself. The tragedy was compounded by the fact that along with the military leaders, many talented designers and engineers who worked under the Marshal's patronage were repressed. The creators of rocket technology, Korolev and Glushko, aircraft designers Tupolev and Petliakov, developers of artillery systems, all of them ended up in camps or sharashkas. This stalled the development of advanced weapons for years. Only the bitter experience of the first months of the war with Germany forced the Soviet leadership to return to the ideas of the repressed Marshal. Tank corps and armies were recreated, and the principles of deep operations again formed the basis of offensive actions. Many of Tukhachevsky's students who survived the repressions, Zhukov, Rokossovsky, Meretskov, became the architects of victory in the Great Patriotic War. Fate decreed that Tukhachevsky's name was struck from Soviet history for many years. It was only in March 1957, during the Khrushchev thaw, that the Marshal was rehabilitated. The military collegium of the Supreme Court of the USSR overturned the 1937 verdict due to the absence of a crime. It was officially recognized that the case against Tukhachevsky and other military commanders was completely fabricated, and confessions were obtained under torture. The Marshal's family was returned his personal belongings and documents, preserved in the NKVD archives. Among them were manuscripts of unpublished works on military theory, a silent testament to the unrealized potential of a great military thinker. Rehabilitation paved the way for the return of Tukhachevsky's ideas to Soviet military science. Gradually, his works began to be published and studied in military academies. Military historians began to impartially analyze the Marshal's contribution to the development of strategy and tactics. A striking fact emerged. Many decisions made by the Soviet command during the Great Patriotic War were, in fact, based on Tukhachevsky's concepts, although his name was not mentioned. Paradoxically, the ideas of the repressed Marshal continued to live on in the practice of military operations. Operation Bagration in 1944, during which Belarus was liberated, became a classic embodiment of the deep operation theory. The massive use of tank armies, air support, and airborne landings behind enemy lines. All this was foreseen by Tukhachevsky a decade before the war. Marshal Zhukov, who led the planning of this operation, was a student of Tukhachevsky and largely relied on his ideas. Tukhachevsky's concepts were even more vividly manifested in the Manchurian operation of 1945. The rapid advance of mechanized units through deserts and mountains, deep encirclements, the use of airborne landings, all this seemed to have come straight from the pages of his theoretical works. When Allied analysts studied this operation after the war, they were surprised to note its similarity to the concepts outlined in Tukhachevsky's works back in the 1930s. The Marshal's legacy proved to be in demand not only in the USSR. After the war, his works were translated into many languages and began to be studied in military academies in Europe and America. Western military theorists recognized that Tukhachevsky was a decade ahead of his time in understanding the nature of modern warfare. French General Charles de Gaulle, who personally knew the Marshal from German captivity, wrote, "Tukhachevsky was one of those rare men who are capable of foreseeing the future of military art. His concepts had a huge impact on the development of military thought in the 20th century. In the post-war USSR, Tukhachevsky's name gradually returned from oblivion. In the 1960s, the first biographical studies dedicated to the Marshal were published. His portraits appeared in museums and textbooks. However, a complete historical assessment of his activities did not occur. Official historiography preferred to avoid the sharp corners associated with the reasons for the repression against military commanders. It was only during the years of perestroika that archival documents became available, which made it possible to reconstruct the full picture of the tragedy of 1937. Today, Mikhail Tukhachevsky is recognized as one of the outstanding military theorists of the 20th century. His concepts are studied in military academies, and his experience is analyzed by historians. In modern Russia, streets and squares bear his name, and monuments have been erected. In 2013, a memorial plaque was unveiled on the building of the Military Academy of the General Staff in Moscow in honor of the Marshal, a symbolic recognition of his contribution to the development of military education. Tukhachevsky's fate is a tragic paradox of history. A man who created a shield to protect his country was destroyed by the system he served. His ideas, rejected during his lifetime, saved millions of lives during the war. The Red Napoleon did not live to see his Austerlitz, but his military genius continues to live on in modern military science, reminding us of the importance of valuing talent and foresight even when they are ahead of their time.